Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, where we talk about gospel insights through great stories and help you find entertainment that is both true and beautiful. I'm your host, Liz Busby. I'm a writer of science fiction and fantasy, a reviewer of books, and a Latter-day Saint. And with me today is my co-host, Carl.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carl Cranny. I have a PhD in religion, and I like to write on the intersection of religious themes in pop culture.
And then we have two guests with us today. We have Daniel.
Hi, I'm Daniel Ortner. I'm a constitutional lawyer and a big musical theater fan, so really excited to talk about Hamilton today.
And then we also have with us today Kristen.
Hi, everybody. My name's Kristen. I study the representation of LGBTQ Mormons in theater, and I have 2 degrees in theater. And then I currently work at a library and as an assistant director for an interfaith fellowship program doing ecumenical work.
Awesome. And we're really excited to have both a theater person and a constitutional lawyer with us today, because this is kind of our 4th of July special. Today we're going to be talking about Hamilton, an American musical by Lin-Manuel Miranda. The play premiered in 2015, but we're specifically talking about the 2020 recording that's available on Disney+. If you, for some reason, aren't familiar with Hamilton, it's a historical retelling of the story of founding Father Alexander Hamilton with a blending of musical and hip hop and rap styles. But first, we're going to start with our best book segment, where we each recommend one thing we're watching, reading, or listening to. My recommendation today is a book about books. It's called The Pleasures of Reading in an Age of Distraction by Alan Jacobs. I just finished this book, and it's kind of a manifesto for reading what you want to read and not feeling guilty about not reading or appreciating the classics, and also a defense that reading is not dead in the age of the internet. So it's got a lot of just really great quotes on reading. I actually picked up this book because I saw a quote from it on a reading blog I follow, Modern Mrs. Darcy, about the 5 appropriate adult reactions to reading. So it's really interesting. Lots of ways to think about your own journey as a reader, and kind of a celebration of reading. So very much a nerdy reader book, but I really enjoyed it. Carl, what have you got for us today?
So I have recently re-upped my subscription to Apple TV Plus because the new season of For All Mankind has started, and I have forgotten that, this is probably, in my opinion, one of the best shows, if not the best show, available right now. It is a sort of alternate history where Russia got to the moon first, and so the space race basically never ended. And it explores sort of the what if we had taken the space program more seriously after the Apollo missions that landed us on the moon and helped America win the space race. By the end of season 1, they have a permanent base on the moon. By the end of season 2, they're getting ready to go to Mars. Now they're in season 3. We've just started the race to Mars. They've got a private company going to Mars. They've got NASA, and then they've got the Russians all going there in the same launch window in 1994. And just the characters are interesting. They're telling the story sort of decades apart. It's run by Ronald Moore, who did so many of the great episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation and then the new Battlestar Galactica reboot. It is a fantastic show, and I started watching it again, and the first episode of season 3 had me gripping my chair and sort of gasping, and just it is a fantastic show, and I cannot recommend it enough. It's not just for science fiction geeks, and I've forgotten how good the show is, and started watching it again as the new season dropped and just went, oh, wow. So, For All Mankind on Apple TV Plus is my hearty recommendation this time.
So is this one of those where they're releasing the episodes week by week, or is the whole thing available for binging?
Unfortunately, Apple TV Plus does the week by week thing, and so I personally find the Netflix version where they just release the whole thing at once much more satisfying, because then I totally would have finished the whole season, because this show is made for binge watching. They do a great job of ending every episode on not a cliffhanger, but what's going to happen next sort of moment. I guess that's kind of a cliffhanger. Anyway, it's very well crafted. The whole thing is excellent. But yeah, if you want to watch the whole thing, maybe wait a month and then pay your $6 to Apple TV Plus, and you can binge all 3 seasons at once, and you will, because it's really good.
Fantastic. Okay, Daniel, what have you got for us today?
I have two book recommendations. The first one is called Praying with the Enemy by Stephen T. Collis. He's a fellow lawyer. He's a constitutional lawyer studying religious liberty, but this is a novel that he's just published. And it's an amazing true story about a soldier, a pilot who shot down during the Korean War in enemy territory, and how he survives. And about a Korean soldier who's secretly a Christian, and how their lives intersect with each other. So it's a really gripping story, very well written. Really really positive and uplifting message of faith and perseverance, and I really enjoyed it a lot. It's on Deseret Book published it, so if you have audio Bookshelf Plus, it's the audiobooks on there to listen to. That's how I listened to it for free, and I really enjoyed it immensely. It was just really compelling listen, and very well written. And Steve Collis is is a very promising writer, and a great person as well. The second one that I want to recommend is the Burning Book. It's by Jason Olson and James Goldberg. It's a memoir of Jason Olson's life. He's a fellow Jewish to Latter Day Saint convert. And so it was a great read for me to read his story, and see how our paths were similar and different in many ways. But I think it's a very compelling memoir of a faith journey, and it really integrating his Jewish identity with his Latter Day Saint faith, and coming to terms with those things. And I thought it was an excellent memoir, and very very well written, very witty, and well refined. And I thought it was highly enjoyable.
The Burning Book is on my reading deck right now. I'm excited to hear your good review of it. So, oh,
It's hard. I mean, I'm a little biased given that it's a lot of parallels to my story, and so we even both went to Brandeis. It didn't overlap, but went to Brandeis at the similar periods in our lives. Though I was that's where I joined the church, and he was there afterwards. But it was still a similar, so many similarities. So I'm a little biased, but I really enjoyed it.
yeah, I think Latter-day Saint literature has a lot to learn from Jewish literature. So it'll be interesting to see kind of this overlap in that book. So, Kristen, what do you have for us today?
Yeah, like Daniel, I kind of picked up two here. So my first recommendation is Consuming Religion by Catherine Lofton. I met Liz at the Mormon History Association's conference recently, and Catherine Lofton just gave this amazing plenary on the Mormon smile that I thought was fascinating. So I grabbed her most recent book. It came out in 2017, I believe, and it's about consumption and being in a consumerist society, and looking at that through the framework of religion. And it's a series of essays. I just started it, but I'm already really enjoying it. And the second recommendation I have is a little silly, but I got COVID like a month and a half ago now, maybe just a month ago, and wanted something light to read, wanted something really easy, and I started reading the Animorphs series. I don't know if any of you remember that from the 90s. But I'm saying I didn't read them when I was a kid. My older brother did. I always looked at the covers with fascination. I think they're quite good and quite entertaining and very dark for kids' books. And I think they're funny to look at as a product of a very specific cultural time. So I'm enjoying the Animorphs. I'm on the third one. If anyone wants to revisit their childhood, I recommend.
Oh, my husband did that. I think last summer he read like 13 of them because they're so short. You can just like through them. But yeah, apparently they hold up pretty well, which is surprising for those mass-produced long series. But
Yeah, like a lot of them are ghost written, even, but I think the concept is strong and it's so willing to be absolutely bizarre and weird that you just kind of have to give it to them a lot of times.
I have to get my 8-year-old to read them, and then I can borrow her books and read them as well.
Yeah, there you go.
oh, that's fantastic. Well, on to the main event. We're going to talk today about Hamilton. Oh, what to say about Hamilton? Where do we start? Kristen, you had some kind of background that you wanted to give us on like the difference in reception when the musical came out first in 2015 versus the video recording, the movie version on Disney Plus. I don't know if you can call it a movie version. It's more of a filmed stage version. But talk to us a little bit about the reception of the musical and how it's changed over time.
Yeah, I'd really love to, because I told my friend we were going to be talking about Hamilton, and they sort of said, well, what new can you say about Hamilton? And I said, well, we're approaching it from this Mormon angle. Like, I think that's already kind of interesting. And what is there about that? So one of the things that I was thinking about, and this is just sort of context, but just about the way that musical theater as an art form is really this uniquely American art form. Some people say it's one of the few really uniquely American art forms. Others, including jazz, comic books, obviously this is sort of a contested category, what counts as a truly American art. But musical theater certainly is one of them, like it's always included in the list. And I just think Hamilton is a really good example of a marginalized group using musical theater as this very American style to make an argument for their inclusion within America and the American founding myth and American identity. And with that, and to what Liz was saying, I think you also see that as really specifically coming out of this Obama era where assimilationist politics were kind of the status quo. And that the point of Hamilton is not really to critique the founding or to be overly critical of the founding fathers, although they certainly engage in some complexity there, but to say, well, what if people of color were just included in this system? What if Obama could become president? And we don't really need to be overly critical of the country or the Constitution or anything like that. And so that's when it comes out. It comes out in 2015 in this moment of optimism, in this moment where Obama is president. And I don't know about y'all. I'd be really curious to hear kind of how you have been engaging in the musical over time. But at that time, I just remember everyone being so excited about Hamilton. Like it was the most hyped musical ever. And then you fast forward to when the Disney Plus version comes out in 2020. And at least in my circles, there was a whole different conversation happening around Hamilton. There was a lot of criticism about Hamilton. Some of it, I think, fair, some of it a little overblown, perhaps. But I'm just, part of what interests me in that is just how the political world shifted after the 2016 election and certainly after the killing of George Floyd, and how some of the promises of Hamilton ended up feeling kind of hollow for many people. So that's just a little bit of context and a little bit of provocations. I mean, I wonder if anyone else had thoughts or feelings about that shift.
I thought that the shift was really interesting. I saw a lot of the online discussion about that shift. For me, I mean, what I loved about Hamilton when it came out and since is that optimism about America, that view of America as this land of opportunity. And I think it is a very conservative, in many ways, vision of America, a very traditional view in many respects, where you're seeing people are of minority descent are seeing themselves in that founding story. And I find that really powerful about Hamilton. I always have that. Uh, these were, historically white men. Some of them were slave owners, but we can, in their story, in their pursuit of justice, pursuit of a greater vision, see ourselves wherever we come from, whatever our backgrounds are. We can see ourselves in that story. So I always loved that about Hamilton. So for me, that really still resonates deeply with me. That ideal of America as a nation where even orphan immigrants can have a shot as a land of opportunity, a land of vision, a land of promise. So I've always loved that about Hamilton, and that for me that hasn't changed. But I think it's interesting how like the culture has shifted away from that in many ways since, especially I think the 2016 election and then the events of 2020. I think really have shifted the culture away from that, and I think it's something worth fighting for and embracing and honoring. And so I think Hamilton for me has become more resonant, maybe even over time, than before, because it's holding on to something that I think culturally has been lost in some ways. So for me, it's much more powerful even now than it was even when it came out.
I never listened to Hamilton or saw it before the Disney Plus version. So when I encountered it, sort of all of this history had already kind of happened. I was encountering it for the first time, had like a vague notion, but musical theater isn't really my thing. Uh, of So I had a vague notion of what it was about, and that it was really popular and everybody really liked it. And my seminary students like looked at me aghast when I was like, "What's Hamilton?" In like 2000, I think 16 or something like. What is wrong with you, brother Carl? And then to encounter it amidst all of the shenanigans in 2020 and the years leading up to it um, was interesting to me because while it seemed very positive overall towards America, and the word that I sort of came away with it would be uh, cultural appropriation. That all these various minority people had taken what these white landowning, sometimes slave owner people had given us and celebrated all the good that they gave us. But then in the 2020 moment when I watched it and really encountered it fully for the first time, saw how much work the American project still has yet to do to become the thing, the promise that the original founding gave to us, that all men are created equal, and the sort of rule of law, and the fact we're the oldest constitutional republic in the world. But we still call it the American experiment. And that also was very prescient to me when I watched it. I was like, oh, I am so glad that these people are owning all the good that came from the founding of our nation. But it also felt very obvious to me in this moment that there's still a lot of work to be done. And so I never encountered the shift from the Obama era sort of reaction to Hamilton to the Trump era reaction to Hamilton. I just encountered it at the Trump stage going and sort of seeing the blend of the two. It was my initial reaction to it, having encountered it so late in my own life and in its life.
Yeah, and I think this reaction to Hamilton and Hamilton itself kind of shows us the tensions of telling historical narratives, right? There's this tension of like, do you tell something that's a hagiography that's creating this, this mythology that we believe in and found our identity on, which America did for a long time, like telling this very sanitized version of history and how great America is. And then there's also the swing to like the skeletons in the closet. Do we talk about how, Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal and owned a bunch of slaves? And finding the balance between those two. Maybe what the difference was between 2015 of like having this idealized narrative of America and feeling hope, to 2020 where many people were feeling like America's falling apart. Look at all these problems. We need to look at the problems. I think we see the same thing when people are talking about church history, right? There's the tension between creating a church narrative that's faith promoting and that's inspirational versus looking at the difficulties of church history and the many troublesome parts of church history and even our theology. and there's the even a Hamilton like attempt to reclaim those things to incorporate like folk magic from Joseph Smith's time into Mormon literature and like say, yes, this is part of it, and here's how we're going to make it part of Mormonism. So Hamilton does play with that interesting tension, especially in the racial blind casting, or rather like the reverse racial casting. I don't know what you call that, but like purposefully casting all these white men as Black and as minorities. It's interesting.
I will say in the theater world, that's typically called race conscious casting. So, not the idea that you're race blind, because obviously they're not. In fact, they kind of got in trouble when they put out their casting call because they said, we only want people of color for these lead roles. And there was this kind of controversy around that. But it is clearly race conscious casting, and they're making very specific choices.
Could I want a lyric that I really like on this topic from Hamilton in the very end, in The World is Wide Enough, just the very end during the duel between Hamilton and Burr. Hamilton says, "The legacy, what is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. I wrote some notes at the beginning of a song someone will sing for me. America, you great unfinished symphony, you sent for me. You let me make a difference, a place where even orphan immigrants can leave their fingerprints and rise up." I love that summation of that ideal of America, of like this. I love the imagery of an unfinished symphony, where everyone who comes can make a difference and shape that symphony. I think that's a beautiful metaphor to me of that American promise, or that American experiment.
That even reminds me of President Uchtdorf's reframing of the restoration as the ongoing restoration, right? When we view the restoration as complete and done in these, 30 whatever years that Joseph Smith had, versus a continuing project, it changes our view of the history.
Yeah, Liz, I was going to say a really similar thing. Like, of course, we belong to a globalizing and global church, but watching Hamilton with this podcast in mind, it just made me reflect on the project of Mormonism as this kind of, as coming out of this American experiment, and as incorporating a lot of those same kind of ethics in a big way.
I love the metaphor from that lyric of the garden, because the garden is never finished. Like, you don't, it's not something that ever can create. The symphony metaphor maybe is in that case a little less appropriate to me, because you can finish a symphony and then you can perform it and it's done. But a garden, there are always going to be weeds. There are always going to be problems cropping up. Some trees are going to die. You're going to have to replace some plants. Maybe one year you want to plant certain kinds of flowers, and the next year you want it to be more of a food garden. And it's an ongoing process that never ends. And that is a good metaphor for life in general, for the church, for America, for everything. Like, you will never be done. And I think it's a fantastic metaphor to plant seeds. And even the scriptures sort of say this. And there's one lyric when George Washington is retiring, he quotes the Old Testament: "Every man will go sit under his own tree and eat his own figs."
Vine and fig tree.
Right.
I'm like humming it in my head as you're saying it. Yeah.
Yes. And that's actually from a letter that George Washington wrote also. So that's an authentic George Washington quote as well, from a letter that he wrote to the Jewish community in America about religious freedom and liberty. So it's from a letter that he wrote towards the end of his administration.
Yeah, and I think this testifies to like the greatness of Hamilton, that like all of us are saying, yeah, these songs have been stuck in our head. Like Hamilton is just so well written, and I love how the different songs play off of each other, and you have these different motifs that just show up as one line in several songs and pull those thematic things through. It's just so well done. Like,
He wrote that to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, in 1790. A letter where he quotes that part of Isaiah about the vine and fig tree.
Yeah, I mean, I think to Liz's point, I I certainly actually have a lot of ambivalence around Hamilton. I think, agree with some of the criticisms, maybe more than Daniel and the rest of you, but it's really hard to argue that it's not an incredibly written show, just like so tightly written. I remember my brother and I really wanted to show my mom It's Quiet Uptown, and she had not listened to any of Hamilton before, and we kept trying to figure out where's the starting point where you introduce people into It's Quiet Uptown so you get them to cry. And it's just such a tightly written show that we kept having to like go back a song and back a song and back a song until I think we probably started with Say No to This, but there's a lot of, it's just such a tightly plotted, meticulously plotted, and the musically so complex, and those musical themes that weave in and out are just so incredible, really.
Lin-Manuel Miranda is one of America's cultural treasures right now, and he is an immigrant, and he got the job done.
I gotta say, I was disappointed with Encanto, though, musically speaking, but that's maybe a different conversation.
I said that when we did our episode on Encanto, but I felt so bad saying it because I'm like, who am I to challenge the master?
I'm a big fan of the Encanto music, but I mean, we don't talk about Bruno. I think is a very Lin-Manuel Miranda-esque song. You can definitely feel his fingerprints on that one.
For sure. Yeah, you can see the melodies interweaving like they do in Hamilton. Even in Encanto, you hear those callbacks.
Yeah. It's Quiet Uptown is one of my favorite songs in the whole show. I mean, it's one of the most gospel like message that fits with the gospel. This message of forgiveness. I love Angelica's line where she says, "There are moments where the words don't reach. There's a grace too powerful to name. We push away what we can never understand. We push away the unimaginable." And then it's the chorus, forgiveness. Can you imagine? Forgiveness. Can you imagine? I love that message of grace and forgiveness and reconciliation after this like unspeakable tragedy in their family. That's always been one of the most powerful moments in the show for me.
I mean, it still makes me cry.
Well, and then there's the interesting, like, there's forgiveness for Hamilton for what he did to Eliza, but there's also like this theme throughout the whole show of Aaron Burr is the one telling giving the narration about Hamilton and like introducing the different scenes, and the humanizing of Aaron Burr is not just, the villain of this story. Like, he should be the villain of the story. He killed our protagonist, right? But he ends up being very sympathetic and very human. And so in that way, like, it is a very religious and forgiving and merciful show to show that, even these people who did these horrible things are human and deserve forgiveness and understanding.
Which is something I would hope that we all take from either Hamilton or various sources. I frequently see sort of the idea that we don't need to listen to those people because they lived in the past and they had things wrong. And part of my training as a Catholic theologian is to look at time in a way that I don't think most people do anymore, where we think in terms of centuries. Like, the Catholic Church is still working out what Vatican II even means, and it happened in the mid-60s. Like, we're 60 years out, and they're still like, we're not quite sure what was going on there. And so this idea that we don't need to pay attention to those people in the past because they, owned slaves or didn't believe women could vote or, insert cultural sin here. I think we should all take a little bit of humility and think, what are people 3 centuries from now going to say about us? Because they're going to have the same conversations. Oh, those early 21st century dolts, they didn't understand X or Y or Z or whatever. And I like that Hamilton showcases all of that to, as you say, to humanize even Burr. I was struck in my rewatch for this podcast of all of his excuses about what happened in the duel before the shot is fired, because he's like, he was wearing his glasses, he was checking his gun, he's doing all, like, I thought he was going to try to shoot me, and so of course I had to perform my role in the duel as if it was a lethal encounter, even though Hamilton was literally going to throw away his shot. And so to set Burr's experience in the duel up, and then the horror when he realizes that he misread the situation, is a great little moment. And I don't know, he's the villain, but I felt bad for him, and so in that, the musical succeeded.
And it should be said, so well performed. Leslie Odom Jr. went against Lin-Manuel Miranda for the Best Actor category, and I think there's a reason why Leslie won. Like, one, he's maybe a bit better technical singer, and I do think the Tonys honor that. But just such an amazing performance, especially there at the end, Carl, where his voice cracks as he's describing, why, if not to take deadly aim, it's him or me, the world will never be the same. That's just such an incredible performance.
I think that Burr's character evolves very dynamically throughout the show. From the very beginning, Hamilton comes up to him and says, "Excuse me, are you in Burr, sir?" And he says, "It depends who's asking." So he's not even willing to say his name unless he knows who's asking for him. But then he, in some ways, I think, is impacted by Hamilton and Hamilton's character, and he embraces some of Hamilton's ideas of taking his shot and not waiting for it, but also misses some of what Hamilton's ideals. He kind of embraces the action focus of Hamilton, but not the ideals that Hamilton pushes for. And so I think he really becomes this very interesting figure by the end. And his journey, I think, is just very, very complex and really well integrated throughout the show.
So too, you see Hamilton picking up things from Burr, like, right before Room Where It Happens, when he says, I've learned this from you. I'm going to talk less, smile more, and get what I need out of Jefferson and Madison.
It's such a good perspective on American history. Like, the grace that we give to Burr is kind of the grace that Hamilton is giving to American history, is saying, let's look at the good things of American history. And it does kind of whitewash some of the negative things that happened, but it's saying there is something noble about American history that we can reclaim, even as we disagree with a lot of the specifics of different things and different compromises that had to be made. I think one of the powerful things about Hamilton is, unlike something like, say, the closest comparison is like 1776, right? So the story of the Declaration of Independence, right? And that ends with the decision to become America, right? And it doesn't go through any of the difficulties of then carrying out that American experiment. And I love that Hamilton, like, the first half is the revolution, and then the second half is the complicating part where you say, okay, we had all these ideals and we fought for these ideals and we were able to be super idealistic during the war, but then he has to compromise. He's forced to compromise to get things done, right? In the room where it happens, he's got to compromise and give things away. And he has to choose not to back Lafayette's revolution, and just all these compromises that get made in the implementation of any government that's based on ideals. So I think in that way, it's a better ideological musical than 1776, because it's focusing on, like, we cannot move on without compromise. We can't have pure idealism as the source of our revolution. Or, okay, say Les Mis also, right? Les Mis is all about these ideals, and then it doesn't really go into, like, oh yeah, French Revolution didn't actually go so well. There were some problems. So Hamilton in that way is actually more realistic about the problems of history and government.
And I love the part where he has to choose, Hamilton has to choose between Burr or Jefferson, and he kind of comes down with, this is a person with whom I fundamentally disagree with about everything. And I forget the number, it's like, there are 75 times that we have gone head to head, but he has ideals, and I'd rather vote for someone who has ideals that I disagree with than somebody who has no ideals. And that's such an interesting, especially as somebody who is generally on the conservative side of the spectrum, but has happily voted for Democrats the last couple of cycles. That is an interesting sort of almost autobiographical moment, or at least that I can see myself in that moment where I'm like, I do not agree with a whole bunch of stuff here, but
at least you're a person with ideals and principles, right?
Right,
Like,
and that has been interesting to see myself in the mirror of Hamilton as I was watching it, preparing for this.
And it's funny as someone on the other side of the political spectrum, as sort of a progressive who really disagreed when with Romney when he was running for president and voted for Obama. I felt the same way. I felt the same way recently, seeing Romney take principled stands against certain things, and just feeling so much respect for someone who I might not agree with on every political issue, but who clearly has ideals and has an underlying ideology that they're following, based in a moral grounding.
It's interesting though that I mean, one thing I've one of my critiques of Hamilton, I think, is the characters of Jefferson and Madison. I don't think they're very well. I don't think that their ideals actually come across very well. I think that that's one of the things I see as a weakness when Hamilton says that. I don't know if it's really earned in the musical necessarily, because Jefferson has been very scheming up to that point and not very principled ultimately. I mean, I guess he pushes for joining the war, I suppose, with joining the side of the French, but he doesn't feel very principled to me as a character. So I find that interesting. That I think historically it actually is more accurate that Jefferson was very idealistic and willing to compromise in some ways, but very dogmatic on other principles that he held. But I don't know that that comes across as well in the musical as historically. To me, that resonates more historically than it does within the show. Actually, it's one of the few things that I think is not earned maybe in the show as much as I wish it were earned.
And he is a bit of a comic character in the musical, I think, in a major way. He provides a lot of comic relief. But I think that's a very good point. I just think compared to Burr, anyone looks principled as he's portrayed in this show.
Though I love the back and forth in the cabinet battle where Jefferson says, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we fought for these ideals, we shouldn't for less. And then Hamilton retorts, Thomas, that was a real nice declaration. Welcome to the present. We're running a real nation. Would you like to join us? Or staying mellow in Monticello. I love that back and forth there. I think that's a great exchange.
There's also a great line that Washington has, I think, where he says, winning is easy, governing is harder, as an echo of when he earlier says, oh gosh, what does he say?
Dying
while
is
the
easy.
war is happening. Dying is easy, living is harder.
Just reminds me, Kristen, your comment about seeing Romney in a new light reminds me of one of my favorite little moments from Bill Maher, who I generally do not agree with, but do enjoy a lot of his political commentary, where after Trump was elected, he went on and publicly apologized to Romney for all the things he said, and then he said some pretty funny stuff where he's like, I will join your church. I will wear your magic underwear. I will baptize my dead people. Please just come around the country. I'm so sorry. And it was just really interesting to see him realize that maybe he had treated Romney a little unfairly, like making fun of the dog on top of the car and some of the things, and suddenly thinking that now we have this other fellow here, Trump. He said, I've cried wolf too much, and now the wolf is here, and I've lost some of my... It was interesting to see him sort of own his role in all of that. And then with the funny commentary on, maybe slightly offensive to Mormonism in general, but it was nice to see a commentator just say, yeah, I got that wrong. And I appreciated that about him.
I mean, speaking of Mormons in the political world, we have Romney. I think, this week we're also thinking about Bowers and his testimony in the committee hearings. I don't know if Liz, you had thoughts about that. I think.
I just think it's important to talk about why Americans are so obsessed with the Constitution and with the 4th of July. Like, in relation to Hamilton, like, American history has almost become part of our scripture, right? Like,
sorry, you said Americans. You meant Mormons are obsessed?
Mormons are obsessed with American history because it's become part of our religion, right? That we believe in the inspired Constitution, and it's I don't know what there is to say specifically about it, but I just feel like there's an important connection there that a lot of Mormons who I know who, might be scandalized by the sexual innuendos and the swearing in Hamilton still love Hamilton because they love the subject of early American history that much that they're willing to put up with these things that they wouldn't put up with in other entertainment. It also helps that it's a musical and Mormons love musicals. But but like it's interesting to see how many people love this musical in our church. And I wonder if it's connected to that belief in the Constitution and in this period of American history as inspired, which influenced Bowers's ability to resist the influence of party to do what would get them power rather than ideals. So there's that contrast again.
One thought I have is I love that Hamilton, the musical shows these founding fathers as young, and they were very, very young, idealistic leaders. And I think sometimes we imagine them in our minds as these wise old sages that got a revelation from heaven in some way for the Constitution. And there is, I think that what the show shows is that they fought for ideals that were inspired, and they had a vision for our country that I think ultimately comes from God, and we really resonate with that. But it was I think a imperfect people experimenting, trying to come up with the best form of government. And I think sometimes we idealize them, imagine them as these wise sages when they were really not, that's not what they were like at all. And I think Hamilton really does a good job of showing them as these young, scrappy, idealistic founders who came with a vision and fought for a vision of an ideal of a country that would, embed these principles of equality, principles of limited government, not overreaching of the government, protection of liberty, of the government that abiding by the rule of law, protecting individual rights. These ideals, I think, were really powerful and are worth fighting for. So I love what when President Oakes gave the talk on the Constitution a couple of conferences ago. He really honed in on 5 principles that he said were foundational and inspired about the Constitution. And it's not every letter or every word of the Constitution. It's very much these ideals of the rule of law, that government power comes from the people and is accountable to the people, and people have fundamental rights. The Bill of Rights, the kind of federalism and the separation of powers, limiting government. I think those ideals are what we really think about. Really, when we say the Constitution's inspired, that's what we should be thinking about, not every word or every action of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Hamilton, who were imperfect people, trying to live up to really impossibly high ideals that they were trying to live up to.
I mean, and it should be said, like, our reverence for the Constitution is enshrined in Scripture. I think it's D&C 101, which talks about the Constitution. But Daniel, when you're also talking about these founders as these young, scrappy, idealistic people, it also makes me think of Joseph Smith and like the youthfulness of Joseph Smith and belonging to a church that honors this kind of youthful, very scrappy and imperfect person. And how, that's I feel similarly to Joseph Smith as I do the founders, a kind of reverence, but also an acknowledgement of imperfection and of, youthful vigor.
For sure. And I like that thing that you said, Daniel, about it's not about any particular, like, we have to honor every single phrase and think everything they said was perfect, but it's the general ideals. And kind of the same way with people will find something Joseph Smith said and say, oh, this was wrong, and therefore the whole thing should be thrown out. And it's a more nuanced approach that we want to take, where like we believe in the restoration, but we still believe he could make mistakes. And things that Brigham Young said, we're not going to like take everything he said and like those are all like the word of God. Like we're going to say the ideals were good and then let's get into the ideals and continue to grow it like a garden, like we were talking about, and to pull out weeds and plant new trees as needed, have this ongoing perspective. To bring back in 1776, I have to say there's a line that Benjamin Franklin says where he says, "What will history think we are, demigods?" Which definitely we have to remember that they were not. They were people. And same with our church leaders, right? They were people.
Something that's interesting to me, sort of on that front, is that the Doctrine and Covenants is quite clear on several occasions that God is displeased with Joseph Smith, and he calls him out. And among sort of the various 19th century religious prophet figures that Joseph Smith finds himself amongst, he is unique in that way, that the Latter-day Saint God is on several occasions tells Joseph explicitly in the Revelations, "You done messed up, Joseph." And I think that's noble of Joseph to include those in the Revelations, and makes me wary of those who want to treat every word, even though Doctrine and Covenants section 1 says, "Whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same." There's still this tension in the Doctrine and Covenants with Joseph, where God says, "Everybody listen to his words in all patience and faith." But Joseph, why don't you knock this or that off? And that's an interesting tension to wrestle with, which again, I think resonates really well with Hamilton and sort of our lauding of the founding fathers and all the good that they did, but also being acknowledging all of their sins.
Yeah, and I think we see that in Hamilton, right, with the infidelity plot line. Like, it's hard to watch that and be like, could we have just like left this out? Could we have omitted it? But then we would also miss out on the, It's Quiet Uptown and the forgiveness themes that we have later, by having that mistake in there.
I was really happy to see that even though it's in 2015 and we have a very sort of different sexual ethic than they would have had in the late 17, early 1800s, that is still obviously shown or portrayed as a mistake. That Hamilton should not have done that. Nobody thinks he's a hero. I mean, some of the other characters sort of want to manipulate it for their own private gain, but it's because they know that nobody's on Hamilton's side, and even Hamilton is just like, yeah, I didn't do anything technically illegal with the monies, but I shouldn't have cheated on my wife, and everybody kind of agrees, yeah, you shouldn't have cheated on your wife.
And I like how it flows very logically from some of Hamilton's character, his strengths and his weaknesses. This moment where he's not with his family where he really should be. He's not taking the time to be with them, and then he's caught in this moment of weakness and has this affair. But I like how it goes from his character flaws. It's organic to his character in some ways that he would fall into this, given that he was I think neglecting his family in many respects, trying to get these bills passed, the bank established, but he was neglecting the things that really ultimately matter, and I think that's a theme in the musical, that he's not able to disattach from the things that he's pursuing to really spend the time he needs to with his wife and others. So I think that theme resonates really well in the show.
And I think it's really driven home at the end when the end is all Eliza's moment, and you have that she's forgiven Hamilton for his faults, and for that very serious fault specifically, and that she's willing to preserve his legacy for him. And she really gets that ending moment, which is, I think, a beautiful moment.
And maybe that's an analogy to like how we should treat American history, right? Like, Eliza's not denying that fault is there and that was a problem, but also not saying, well, let's just erase Hamilton from the history books because he did this bad thing that was really bad. When we're telling American history, maybe we do need to acknowledge those imperfections, but we can also still admire the things they did that were good, that were revolutionary at the time.
I like in the Who Lives Who Dies Tells a Story, she says, I put myself back into the narrative I stop wasting time on peers. I live another 50 years. It's not enough. But I love it's like reinserting yourself into that narrative and then making a difference, like using that, as a launching point to then change the world around her.
Yeah, and so I think that's kind of what Hamilton is. It's reclaiming the narrative of American history, right? It's saying instead of, because we're upset about, rightly so, about slavery and lack of rights for women in early American history, let's not throw away that narrative. Let's put ourselves back in the narrative and reclaim that as part of our history, even as imperfect as it is. So we've been talking for a while, so we're going to move into our ratings segment. We give 3 different ratings. Our first one is for content, clean versus objectionable material, and we rate on a Celestial to Outer Darkness scale. Where would y'all put this? It's not the cleanest of musicals.
But it's also like far from filthy. Like you have swearing and then you have an infidelity plotline. But even as we were just discussing, the infidelity plotline is really presented as like a negative thing that Hamilton has engaged in. And in that, I'm leaning towards Telestial. How are y'all feeling?
I think that feels pretty good. Like, there are probably some relatives and members of my ward who I know would not feel comfortable watching Hamilton. So that I can't give it a Celestial rating because of that. Like, it's not, you need people who are going to be understanding of what it is. But it does treat these, like, infidelity and things like that in a very moral way, which pretty rare in modern filmmaking.
Yeah, especially the Netflix, the Disney Plus version, and beeps the 2 F words in the musical, so you don't even have that, which was a hang up in the original cast recording for me to want to recommend it to people that I know are more conservative. So I think, especially with that, I think that the content, I mean, there's infidelity, but I agree that it's portrayed in a tragic way, and there's this beautiful reconciliation. So I agree with that rating, terrestrial at the least, I think.
Yeah, I would give it terrestrial, just because there are a couple swear words, and even if they bleep it out, you know what was said, right? Like we all understand the various negative things, but the rest of the show is so positive and optimistic and showcasing appropriate amounts of nuance and condemning things that should be condemned, and that overall, despite a couple of these inappropriate moments, um, the overall themes are still very, not gospel centered, because that's a different rating we'll do later, but uplifting and useful and appropriate.
And
And so
moral.
I would give it terrestrial and moral. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, besides the infidelity, there is a lot of innuendo going on, and I think it kind of goes with the style of music, um, that those are in there. And I felt a little uncomfortable watching it with my kids the first time, being like, are they catching on to what he's saying here? I don't know. And we're just going to move on past that, and hopefully it went over your head. Um, so I think it's appropriate to be careful about who you show it to and when, but overall worth seeing. Okay, we do a rating for artistic merit on a scale of 1 to 5 popcorn balls.
If anybody gives it less than 5, I'm gonna come and like fight you personally, because
It feels bad to even like try to pass judgment on it, because it is such an iconic and well done work. And even the camera work that Disney's done with it, like from the stage version where you see like these overhead shots, which you could never see if you saw it in the theater, it's well done.
I think the theme, the recurring themes, the motifs, the way that the themes change over time. Like one day I was talking to this, I was listening to the song "My Shot" with my daughter recently, and she asked about what is he talking about when he says "my shot"? Like, what does a shot mean in that context? And I was explaining that in the show, there's multiple ways that it uses this message of a shot. It's metaphorical, it's literal. Like I was just explaining that to my 8-year-old daughter. I was like blown away by the how Lin-Manuel Miranda weaves these themes throughout the show in really powerful ways. So I'd give it a 5 for sure.
I think we're all agreed on that one. Let's talk about gospel connections on a scale of 1 to 5 apricots. I feel like we've had a really good discussion. I think I would give it 5 apricots just for discussion of history, American history. Like, it's a great way to get into the nuances with older kids and talk about what it means to be an American and about the flaws of American history.
I would also give it 5 apricots as well. Although I'm going to share a little something that might be a little funny and a little off topic from what we've discussed so far. When I was teaching seminary a couple of months ago, we did the book of Job. And Job, for those of you who know a little bit about it, is really dense, and it's like a philosophical dialogue between Job and his 3 friends, but it's all written in really high Hebrew poetry. Like, it is an astonishing work. And so I sort of, in broaching the question of whether or not this is a historical book, I said, it's probably the case that Job was a real person that these things sort of happened to. But imagine that, like, 3,000 or 4,000 years from now, all we have left of Alexander Hamilton's life is the play. Like, it's historically accurate in that there are things that happened to Hamilton that are portrayed accurately in the play, but they didn't have rap battles in their cabinet meetings. And so that's kind of what that's that's what the book of Job is. It's like, maybe this thing happened to this guy, but the version of it we got several thousand years later is a very stylized retelling of that story. And so maybe that's a weird gospel connection, but it's one that my students seem to resonate with when I tried to explain what the book of Job was. Think of it as Hamilton.
Oh, I love that. I love that because it can be difficult to get into that discussion in Sunday school. Like, there are people who take it like super literally. The whole Old Testament is completely literal, and moving people in that direction of like, there's some literary license and interpretation here, and we don't have to like get really upset about these things. We need to take it for what it is. So I like that Hamilton metaphor. Very useful.
And you get so much more out of it when you can understand it on a literary level. Like, not only is it just a more accurate way of understanding the Bible, you're also going to get more of the substance out of it, I think, if you understand those nuances.
I was gonna say the thing that I really appreciate, like related to that, is in Hamilton. There's all these. It goes back to the merits of it. There's all these allusions to other musicals, and if you don't not aware of the other musicals, you're not versed in musical theater. You miss these really powerful allusions to Les Mis or Phantom or Take Your Pick. A lot of these really powerful allusions. So it's similar with reading the scriptures, where if you're not aware of the genre and the time and the context, you're going to miss a lot of the powerful allusions and metaphors.
It has a lot of allusions too to different rap artists and hip hop artists,
which I'm sure went over my head.
Some of those go over my head. Yeah, I know. I'm a little more comfortable with the musical theater references, but I know of a couple of the rap references too.
Well, now I want to have a whole other conversation about all those, because those all went. I am not a musical theater guy, so those all went completely over my head. So I don't know. That's an interesting note, Daniel. That to really understand and appreciate the genius of something like Hamilton, you've really got to do some research and know a lot of secondary stuff. And I would, as a professional scholar of religion, definitely argue that that is also true of Scripture.
Kristen, did you have anything you wanted to say for your rating for Gospel Connections?
Oh, sure. Just that I would probably put it more at like 4 apricots. Just in that, I think, unlike some of the people on the call, I do agree with some of the criticisms about Hamilton, and think that some bits do feel dated, for me at least. I still think it's incredibly moral and very uplifting, and I just am not always sure it's presents the founding myth in a perfectly responsible way.
That's fair. Daniel, what's your rating?
Yeah, I'd give it a 5. I mean, I think that as a overall package, the show really delivers on a message and a vision of the founding that to me is optimistic, but also grounded. And I think that this vision of humanity is really optimistic as well. And Hamilton as a character is such an engaging and powerful character, and his life, I think, is portrayed so well. So I'm a big fan of it in every way.
I want to go read the book that Miranda read that first sparked his interest.
It's a good biography. It's not. I wasn't blown away by it, but it's a solid biography. It's amazing to me to think that a visionary, someone like Lin-Manuel Miranda reads that and imagines a rap musical. It's just amazing to me that he can see it that way, like different way of viewing the world altogether.
And I think he talks about he picked it up at like an airport bookshop while he was heading out on vacation and read it on vacation. And then Hamilton was born from that, which I think is kind of extraordinary.
No pressure for your summer reading, people, but if you are not transforming it into a musical, what are you even doing? So, oh, okay. So, where can people find your work online, Daniel?
Let's see. I'm on Twitter and Facebook, and I write for Public Square magazine about law and religion and politics and a bunch of other things. Written reviews for The Interpreter as well, so you can check those out.
Fantastic. Kristen, where can people find you?
Yeah, I don't use social media super regularly, but if you want to follow me, you can try. My Instagram's Kristen Helen Perkins. And then if you want to keep up with my work, KristenHelenPerkins.com. And I post, where I write on my website.
And Carl?
You can find me on Twitter at Carl Cranny, although I've decided that Twitter's not really for me, so I'm going to keep it, but I don't know that I'm going to be super active there anymore. But there it is.
And you can follow my writing on lizbusby.com and links to my social media on there. This has been Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, encouraging you to seek after everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, or praiseworthy. See you next time.